Sandra, for the really kind invitation. I'm really glad to be able to come back to these topics. And this is very much what this paper is going to do. I'm reminded of Tina Turner's song, what's love got to do with it? You can almost guess my answer, little to nothing. So I'm going to tell you that from the get-go. If you're a big ToM fan, get ready to push back. And if you don't like theories of mind, you're in the right company. So that's how this talk will go. And it's going to be a very big picture talk, as keynotes often are. As I get older, I become to understand why that's so. I did dredge through, just to let you know, about hundreds upon hundreds of very detailed slides. But all that stuff's in my written work. And so this is more an encouragement. If you haven't read that, I'll say go read it. And I'll try to sketch a little bit of a comprehensive back look and a little bit of a where we are now. So there's some interesting new material towards the end. And the rest is, if it's like watching an old TV show that might be rather familiar if you know this material pretty well. But there are some important general reminders I want to make. Before I kick off, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Darwell country here in Australia. That's actually a scene from the front of my house. It's beautiful, and so I take photos of this every morning practically. So this is, an acknowledgement of the care and trust that the Aboriginal peoples of this land have put into keeping this environment so beautiful and nice. So acknowledge them as for that and for their future here in Australia. Okay. Okay, let's get to it. So let's go right back to the beginnings. And I just want to really get down to the root of things, as I often do, and go back to ToM and its relationship to autism. And look, it seems now a long time ago, go back into the 80s and 90s, right? Even further, if we went back to the original origins of this, maybe in the early 70s, right? Where we really first get to meet what ToM is or ToMs are. I'm just going to remind you of a few salient facts. I'm just going to close this down too, so I can. Oh no, I don't want to do that. Hold on. It's just that the images are getting in the way of my seeing. So ToM, as the theory of mind, of course, is embedded in a theory, which is a larger piece that claims that normally developing, and again, this is going to, in the old school way, without even acknowledging this, would have just been neurotypical, the language now. I would want to challenge the emphasis on the neuro here, but let's say cognitively typical humans make sense of themselves and others using a theory of mind. And there's really two functions that the theory of mind has in this. And the oldest one, of course, is that it's meant to give a structure to our that capacity. It structures it because, of course, it tells us how ultimately how it is that certain mental attitudes and states interact legitimately, right? The belief desire thesis. I think in all of this, somebody tried to identify about 7 core principles, right? How do beliefs interact with perception? How do beliefs and desires interact? So that's one thing that it's doing. It's often not the highlight, but if we look at that literature, of course, go back to Lewis in 1972 and the common sense functionalist picture, you get the core idea that the theory of mind is a set of principles describing psychological laws that outline how mental states must relate in the bringing about of actions. And so that's supposed to give you your core understanding in some way. So that structural point is one thing. And of course, there were lots of different theories of how we might acquire that set of laws, that theory that grounds that capacity. Notoriously, most of them thought it would be built in some way, perhaps inherited from our evolutionary forebears. Gopnik and others had produced a more dynamic account. We didn't receive it, but kids crafted it all, and they wound up crafting much the same theory by a certain stage in their early career. But they did this in the same way that adult scientists did, and they actively experimented to come up with, luckily, converge on the same sort of theory. The other part of the story is the application piece. Theory, or theorizing and mind reading are meant to go together. So that's a characterization that builds in a characterization of social cognition in general that gets its life from the spectatorial assumption that holds that our situation with respect to others is fundamentally that of a scientific spectator towards a target phenomena. This is important because this theme is probably the one that comes up more and more in the story. I think the structural one's always there, but this is the one that you'll see even the new variants or new school versions of theory of mind tend to hone to very strongly. And of course, the relation to autism is something like this. It's captured in the excitement around the idea that if this is how ordinary people get about in their folk psychological antics and endeavors, then we have, quote, a substantial body of research that is highlighted. So we were told that the evolution of ToM in non-human primates, its emergence in human ontogeny, and impaired ToM in a variety of psychiatric disorders is going to be substantiated by empirical findings and be a rich way for us to progress and understand the nature of these so-called disorders and then how to address them. Now, this is all, old school. This is from, you see here, 2005. But of course, the really big centerpiece of this had been Baron Cohen's attempt to give us a mind blindness hypothesis that connected ToM very much to an explanation of what's going on. And by the way, although we're talking here about how we might understand autistic individuals in this sense, of course, as that quote just made, it will also apply to other cases of psychiatric and other disorders. That was the big hope back then. So the mind blindness hypothesis, as I'm sure you all know, is that that autistic individual, the mind blindness of autistic individuals is caused by a malfunctioning of the ToM module. So there's a lot built into that already. First, that there is a mind blindness in some important sense. That mind blindness is also, in this hypothesis, a central or the central phenomena to explain other symptoms. And that was a big effort to try to say how it might explain, if not all, then the bulk of the symptoms that we find in diagnosing these conditions. And then the idea was that, yes, all of that in turn could be put down to something faulty in a theory of mind module. So lack of ToM, or theory of mind module, was hypothesized to be the core and possibly universal abnormality of autistic individuals. So that's from 2000, a later comment on it. So just to now sum up that, what really this is this gives us a very specific hard target, a unique and locatable source of the core cause of dysfunction, according to this picture, that we see in autistic individuals. It sets us on the path for finding a single troublemaker, a kind of singular Professor Moriarty who's causing all these discrete crimes that are supposed to be dealt with. That's the picture. And noting the empirical findings, of course, it wasn't that Baron Cohen was in any way not aware of these. Baron Cohen acknowledged that children and adults with the biological condition of autism suffer to varying degrees from mind blindness. So he never really made that as a singular blanket comment. And after all, and around that time, there were plenty of findings that demonstrate that autistic individuals really did vary quite a lot in their responses. Some general claims were made, not to demonstrate, for example, at the time, people were saying, well, they're not wholly mind blind. They demonstrate practical understanding of desire, for example. And other things started to pop into the mix, such as some passing the false belief tests, some 15 to 60% difference in range, so quite a lot of variation there. I won't pause for this, but just to say, of course, all of these findings have to be, these are from 98, 92. It's interesting, even just as a history piece, to go back and look at the questions that are now being raised about the validity of these tests, the context in which they were being pursued. All of that's been put up to grabs all over again. But at the time, these claims were made with a kind of authoritarian surety. And indeed, I suppose the thing that really made the day for the modular version of this claim, at least, was things like finding, or the alleged findings of double dissociations with things like Williams syndromes that strongly supported the signature profiles of autistic individuals could be explained, at least, by a faulty, very domain-specific theory of mind module or mechanism. Because, of course, the interesting thing about modules is supposed to be that they're informationally encapsulated. Now, if you lose a grip on that, then you can still hang on to the idea of a theory of mind, as we'll soon see, but you can think that there's more traffic between the different parts of different cognitive systems, right? That's another way of reviving or thinking about the subject. But this gave the lie to the kind of Swiss Army knife view that there were really specialized functions that theory of mind was responsible for, and that you could knock one of those out, and that would, or aspects of it, and that then could explain the behavioral responses and patterns that you got. That's very standard state, mainstream, classical cognitivist, and particularly modulist account. And indeed, and I'm now just jumping ahead, I'm not going to have time to go through all the arguments about why we might want to raise questions about any and all of what I just said. But here's the thing, and I think this is the more strategically big picture point, really nicely put by Matthew Belmonte. Autism is often held up as the clinical evidence, or perhaps the clinical justification is a more apt term, of the notion of a theory of mind module. So it was supposedly that the theory of mind module was meant to come in and independently explain the phenomena, but in a way, the phenomena seemed to give it the coherence of those problems, and it seemed to give a justification for believing that such a thing existed. As he puts it, to see a person with autism, we are told, is to see what happens to a human being when the ability to mentalize, mind read, engage in theory of mind, is switched off. And on the surface, this is neatly specific. The theory of mind explanation seems to fit the facts, and the facts seem to play it back in and give us a kind of picture that we should believe. Okay. Here's another quote on this, and this is from 2013. So it's, another 10 years or more now, 12 years have gone by since this quote came out. Fast forward nearly 30 years, and this theory of mind refrain has become empirical fact. It's treated at the time, and certainly was at the time, as if these were just, whilst they're cast as explanatory hypotheses, they were pretty much, no one was doubting the existence of these things. Whole academic enterprises have emerged around theory of mind, for ToM's very existence necessitates questions concerning the limits and boundaries of the mind and humanity itself. And we'll come back to that. And this author tells us, being forcibly detained by therapists come faculty, a kind of terrible experience for her, I found myself deeper within the narrative of neurological determinism. Regardless of what I said, it was my autism saying it, or really it was the faulty theory of mind that was responsible, and therefore engendered a whole ways of treating other people. And this is the theme that I will be picking up, and I know it's a theme of the conference. So look, this is the consequences of this. Some people say, oh, these philosophical work and theorizing doesn't really have implications. But I think that's to fail to take a good stand and look at larger pictures of this kind. Okay. So that was ToM, at least, as I said, go back at least 12 years. Now, I haven't been working as steadfastly on this. I've been working on other things as I used to. And so I just wanted to get a picture. I know a fair bit about where we are now. I probably don't know as much as everyone who's working at the forefront of these debates, but it certainly looks as if it seemed like for a time, and Sean Gallagher and I did a lot of work to help cast some doubts and change the game, I think, with respect to the dominance of not just theory of mind in the way that I've been describing it, but also simulation theory and those very standard ways of thinking. It used to be, prior to a lot of the things that we did back in the 2000s, that those were just the only games in town. It wasn't quite the Fedorian comment about the language of thought, that it was the only game. It was rather that some combination of those two, some hybrid account, even if, say, the core structural features were taken by simulation theory, they would still need some theorizing in order to get an accurate mind reading account of what another person was thinking in daily life and such like. So those were really dominant back in the day. And you'd have thought under the pressure against modules and all the rest that ToM may well have faded, but that's not really so much where we are. It seems that in some areas, it's kind of risen anew in Phoenix-like, in new forms. And I'll just give you a couple of examples here, and I'm sure you can locate more. So I just recently found this on Transmitter, Theory of Mind in Autism, a research field reborn. And here's the headline piece of clickbait. Scientists initially embraced the notion that autistic people have difficulty with theory of mind that we just talked about. And some went so far as to assert that it explained the condition's core traits, which we just talked about. Many came to view it as passé, which I just said, but aspects of the original idea are enjoying a renaissance, apparently. What is why and in what format and how so? Well, one big area where that's true, definitely, has been the rise of predictive processing accounts of mind. And here, of course, the core idea, which is supposed to be, again, not just located in the special modular domain of thinking about other the mental states of others per se, but of thinking about any problem. So the idea here is that the very core of cognition is it making inferences to the best explanation about states or affairs or causes that are not within our direct access. So on this picture, the model very centrally is to model the brain as doing the work of a scientist in some very crucial and important sense. And if the brain is acting as a scientist in advancing hypotheses, testing them and adjusting them as it goes along, it's natural to say if that's the general feature of what minds do, it's going to be the same thing when you apply it in the social cognitive domain. So here's Jacob Howie making this point. The problem of causal inference for the brain is analogous in many respects to our everyday reasoning about cause and effect and to the scientific methods of causal inference. And that's 2013. That picks up where that last quotation that I gave you ended in the last section. So suddenly, of course, there's a revival very naturally. Theory of mind is back in business, but not necessarily in the strictly informationally encapsulated modular form. So others, Andy Clark, Surfing Uncertainty, and I'm sure if you've been paying attention to this has become a really very popular way of thinking about how cognition works, even at the most simple level. Okay. And we've had other things too, such as Celia Hayes' work trying to give us an account of what she calls cognitive gadgets. And this is what she says exactly about mind reading. Mind reading is very similar to print reading, a very unusual thing. So it's not something that we should have picked up from our forebears in the way that previous versions might have said. Both of these distinctively human skills recover meaning from signs, depend on dedicated cortical areas, are subject to genetically heritable disorders, show cultural variation around a universal core, and regulate how people behave. What's interesting about Hayes here is that this isn't just Gopnik's idea that children have to act as little scientists, but nor is it something like the Fodorian module picture. So this is a quite updated version of what a theory of mind might be. But, and here's the stinger from my point of view, she says, if I'm right, distinctively human ways of thinking are products of cultural evolution, so not so much the biological. This is a really big change, very close to my heart in some ways, but this is the bit that I think we should be cautious about. And this is, again, if it's reinserting a theory into the system, I would be especially cautious about it. She says, they are pieces of technology embodied in the brain. So what's happening is we're building into the brains of people something like a theory of mind, even though we're getting the theory of mind materials, as you'll see, I tend to agree, from our cultural resources. Okay. Here's the thought. We are, on her view, we still have gadgets. Their installation isn't going to be tied to biological evolution, which gets around some of the old problems. It's rather that, as she puts it, the information we get from others, handled by general purpose mechanisms, builds distinctively human ways of thinking, which in her case would include building in a theory of mind. Okay. Okay, that's just a sketch of the developments to give you a very high level. Those theories are all very different. We all know that the world, there's 1,000 flowers in science, so there's always going to be lots and lots of versions. ToM has proved pretty robust, but I'm going to say some things here to hopefully cast some serious doubt on whether we should take ToMs seriously as technically as a scientific construct. And I won't be able to do full justice to these arguments, so you'll have to read up or come back to me afterwards. So what's the Achilles heel? Well, I think the Achilles heel comes from what's often regarded as the negative work, although I think it's quite positive work, that REC and radical and activists and others have been doing over the years to try to put pressure on classical cognitivist constructs. You can try to say that 10 times fast. And here's a couple of fun three-letter acronyms. I'm not a big fan of three-letter acronyms myself, but yeah, some other people apparently like them. So here's two, the hard problem of content and the information processing challenge. And I think if these can't be overcome, and I've yet to see an answer, in my view, that does address them, a lot of people want to skirt them, and there's a lot of that, but I have yet to find a straight answer that overcomes them yet. And you can ask me about that in questions if you like. But these put into jeopardy some of the key ideas that the theory of mind in any of these formats that we've seen must rely on. And it challenges the very framework of classical cognitivism that enables us to think that we could have a series of contentful, anyway, representations, a kind of structure that gave us the laws that would have to be installed for there to be a theory of mind, or for applying it in the kinds of ways that are being assumed in those theories that I just mentioned. So what's going on here? Well, the positive account that the radical and activists want to replace that standard story with is to say that cognizers certainly do make informationally sensitive responses when engaging with environmental offerings. Even the previous talk talking about affordances and Chimero's work, we can work to accommodate that within the story that this would tell. But here's the interesting thing. It presses onto the fact that covariance itself isn't any kind of content. And then it does a lot of detailed analyses of things like the best accounts that we have of how we get natural content. If we start only with covariance that isn't already contentful, those things will be teleofunctional theories. And I think that the big battle is what they can deliver. And I think they can't deliver a theory of content, as many people don't. Many people still think they can, but I don't believe I've seen a version yet that's convinced me that that works. And again, we can take that in questions. Let's take it for the moment that that's the case. Also, covariance isn't any kind of commodity. So realistically, processing of information or picking it up, or all the metaphors that we use when we talk about information in this way are problematic. If those two things don't hold, you don't have the basis or the ground to explain how cognitive theories are the ones we were mentioning can house a theory of mind in the brain, or how it can be used in everyday applications. The brain and other systems don't actually traffic in information, and they don't pick up, process, and store information or informational content, and they don't form contentful conceptual representations on this picture in the brain in order to do things like form hypotheses, etc., about mental states and such like. So I think this is too quick, but I can't take you through all of it, but it's in the writings. This, I think, is where the problem really lies as a technical problem for theory of mind. And there have been attempts to try to, come to some kind of peaceful outcome in these discussions, particularly people working, say, in the free energy areas have been trying to do this. They said the claim was made recently that free energy principle offers a, quote, mathematically informed reading of generative models that could accommodate both richly representational and dynamicist views of cognition, and we can come to some kind of armistice. I don't think so. Unless you've solved the problems I mentioned, I don't see how anything is gained by that theoretically. That's just an attempt to kind of make peace without having come to the table and admitted that we have something else, an account of content that would enable us to do this. We're not trying to just make peace. We're trying to make a clear analysis in theorizing. We get these kind of claims too, about whether these are really using models in the kinds of ways that in the ways that would have to be used in order for these things to do things like form inferences, contentful inferences to the best of their explanation about external phenomena. And the field is really all over the place on this. And here's Friston himself telling us, quote, an agent does not have a model of its world, it is a model. So I'll come back to that, but just work that through if you're trying to think of this as the model was supposed to be the theory that you were testing or making the hypothesis. Now, what happens to this if we expand it so that the system itself is a model, and what would that even mean? Friston explicates this by saying, and author and co-authors say, we must here, quote, understand model in the most inclusive sense as combining interpretive dispositions, morphology, and neural architecture, and as implying a highly tuned fit between the active embodied organism and the embedded environment. I certainly like all of that, but I'm not sure why something that has all those features would be considered to be a model. You might say, well, it's just a model. We're not saying it's using them, so there's no real great threat here. However, I think perhaps if we really think about the question, it's not even that. What you might say, which is better to say, only is that the organism could be used or treated as a model by a sufficiently well-informed third person end user. So it could be treated as a model because we could model it as such. That may be true. And that may be one of the temptations that we have when we talk about the brain, as if it's using models versus the fact that we can find correlations that we can talk about in the brain. That's, again, a longer debate. In any case, for radical and activists and others, cognitive activity is extensive and world-involving. It's not merely occasional, so in special circumstances, extended as the extended mind theory would have it. The radical and activists leave it as an open question whether there might be occasionally any narrow-minded mentality, but it maintains that if there is, then it's explanatorily parasitic on extensive cognition, real-world, widely engaging, environmental, the interesting connections with the world. Just an aside, does this mean that there's no value in understanding what goes on in the brains of autistic individuals, or for that matter, non-autistic individuals? The same critique always comes up. Of course not. My standard answer here is brains, don't leave home without them. You're probably going to need them. But what is claimed in this is we don't have special reasons to focus on what's happening in brains, theorizing, etc. That's not where all cognitive activity takes place. Rather, we should be thinking in terms of an equal partnership principle, which in 2017, Eric, Meehan, and myself describe in this way, that invoking neural, bodily, and environmental factors can all make equally important contributions when it comes to explaining cognitive activity. All such factors can carry equal explanatory weight. In other words, they have that kind of status. It does depend on the needs of the particular case. So to pick this up and some other recent work, Ramstead, Kirchhoff, and Constant and Friston make this sort of claim. The boundaries of the cognitive system are nested and multiple, and that with respect to its study, cognition has no fixed or essential boundaries. And certainly they don't have a boundary that locates cognition wholly within brains. So on some occasion, privileging the brain will be required to explain some phenomena under consideration. On other occasions, privileging other factors would make more sense, which isn't to say that there's no part for the brain to play, etc. And maybe in the other cases, we're saying if we privilege the brain, we're not saying there's no other factors involved in these phenomena. If you are interested, my PhD is very excited about this. Lorena has been working on this material with me. But there's a whole lot of interesting new work about emergence in contexts from the point of view of the philosophy of science that pushes very much in this direction already. So the claim here is that network neuroscience, social neuroscience, systems biology, 4E cognition, separately and collectively strongly suggest that something like a contextual emergence, when we dig into the details, that's to say that things don't happen in a vacuum. They're situated, and those situations and environmental situations really matter to understanding phenomena in question. I have written on this before, and I would argue the same is obviously true, in my point of view, for any kind of ordinary capacity to make sense of others in everyday life. Okay, so now I'm just going to swiftly move to this part of the talk, doing without ToM. The big idea here is that of the narrative practice hypothesis is that we can pick up both the structural account, but also instead of having a spectatorial stance, that we can have an interactive picture of how it is that we come to understand others. And this, I think, is the key to this move. So engaging in socially supported storytelling activities, according to the narrative practice hypothesis, is the normal route for developing our folk psychological competence and the capacity to act for reasons and to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons. So that's using the suite of articulate, drawing out connections between mental states. And that story doesn't look inside heads, it looks to environmental artifacts, special kinds of artifacts, folk psychological narratives housed in both oral and textual traditions. In the context, and we use those artifacts in the context of distinctive interactional practices, and that equips us in our different settings to be able to make sense and understand one another. The big idea here is that is a loop into the environment, and that stories and artifacts and these practices, these narrative practices, are a major part of that shapes our capacity. Of course, that makes a difference to what happens in our brains, but it doesn't install a theory of mind, contra what Hayes had been suggesting. So on this model, the function of folk psychology also turns out to be slightly different. It's not about being able to make accurate predictions or explanation from a third person point of view, but it enables to give second person normalizing explanations. So any number, if I want to know why you're doing what you're doing, any number of explanatory relevant factors might be required mention of in order to make sense of it. And you might have to elaborate on those as well, even after having told me what your attitudes are in question. You might have to elaborate and give a longer story about why it is that those attitudes are formed, why they make a difference as they do to your activities. So crucially on this model, like historical explanations, these explanations don't aim at abstract prediction and retrodiction. That's why folk psychological narratives are going to be particularly idiosyncratic, personal, and particular. And from the get-go, the narrative practice hypothesis, for that very reason, emphasized in contra the spectatorial stance that was assumed by theory and simulation theory, that really we had to abide by horse's mouth's principle. One-to-one extended second-person dialogue through which the other tells their stories is the most reliable, though still fallible, way that we can learn about another person's reasons for acting or their state of mind or how they come at things. So here's the payoff. The NPH encourages an approach to an active empathizing, which understands empathy as a sustained effort to seek and establish an essentially intersubjective connection with the other, to actively engage with them over time. This process may involve hearing another stories through a sustained effort to appreciate their situation, noting differences and similarities between their story or their situation and that of our own. But here's the important part. An active empathizing is not the same as attempting to understand the other by putting oneself in the other's place or shoes or taking the other's perspective. None of this. It's this sustained active listening that's important and engagement. Now, if we took that on board, as Belmonte put it, if we accept the narrative practice hypothesis and deny the existence of a modular theory of mind, then are we robbed of an explanation for autism? Well, the answer is no, because the theory of mind explanation feels itself never to have been sufficient one in the first place. But I would also say it's a mischaracterization, embedded from my earlier comment, a mischaracterization of autism itself. And this is very well rehearsed in literature as a disorder. That's the issue. So on this picture, I don't use the word mind reading, but I'll use it here in this quote. Quote, what looks like a mind reading deficit may be the result of a different development of critical, social, emotional, communicative, and cognitive capacities. So a different, diverse way of doing things. And that's exactly the position that I defended along with Ines Hippolyta and Nick Chown in our contribution to this volume, Cognitive Diversity, Not Theoretical Deficit. So what happens then is, individual differences independently of, before we even get into questions of different classes or populations of people, you might need to accommodate for different things along the way developmentally if people aren't picking up the important parts in a narrative interaction. So, for example, to take a very crude example, sometimes the concepts that are essential to the story but are not really discussed. For example, in Little Red Riding Hood, most versions never say explicitly Little Red Riding Hood thought the wolf was grandmother. You have to figure that out when she says, "What big eyes you have, grandmother." You can't help by discussing these concepts, but you can help someone who hasn't caught on to this, if that happens, by discussing those concepts in addition to just reading the story or finding a way to weave that in. That kind of interaction or on the hoof activity is what you would need to do if your interlocutor or your partner isn't quite picking up on what needs to be picked up on. Help to make the characters they're thinking more obvious by putting their thoughts and emotion into the language directly. It doesn't always depend on the child being able to figure it out. And we've seen similar things working in other contexts. That's what social stories have been used for, and they have apparently been proven to be effective to some extent in some cases, and is today one of a major intervention strategies for helping people to understand others. Okay. And of course, since I'm an activist here, I'm not suggesting that everything is always mediated, as the previous talk was saying. We might want to distinguish between folk psychologically narrative-based ways of understanding others and more interactive engagements with others. But both things we can look as an interactive profile on this model. Successive enactive therapies have and are being developed that work by making targeted adjustments to the content, style, timing, and rhythm of embodied interactions that don't involve narration along specific parameters. So that too, and that's another huge topic. So this is the epilogue, and then I'm going to close very quickly. I just want to say a couple of words about double empathy, enactive empathy, and the narrative practice hypothesis is a gesture towards where I think things are now and where they might go. So the whole idea, as you probably already realize, is that empathy, double empathy claims causes it a problem, but really you might just think of it as a fact of the situation. In any interpersonal interaction, there are always going to be two-way streets. That's what the NPH and the enactive approach should be saying. Interestingly, in the same volume, Neurodiversity Studies, Alyssa Hillary, who herself is neurodivergent, wrote a really compelling essay. And here's from a recent review of the book that came out in Disability Studies Quarterly. They write, Alyssa Hillary's essay, Neurodiversity in Cross-Cultural Communication, represents one of the most thought-provoking essays in this volume. Through its engagement with a non-ableist application of Daniel Hutto's narrative practice hypothesis and with Damian Milton's double empathy problem, Hillary's essay reaffirms the importance of neurodivergent narratives and offers important insights on how treating neurodivergent cultures as subcultures in terms of cross-cultural communication can improve cross-neurotype communication. I think that's really accurate. And secondly, if you read her essay, she calls out an early paper of mine from 2003, in fact, for getting things right with the general move for the narrative practices, but then getting it appallingly wrong in some of the things that I was saying, which were picked up from the literature at the time about the capacities of autistic people, but it also was driven at the time by taking up a third-person scientific stance myself in authoring the paper and describing therein what those capacities would look like and taking that those kind of claims about the capacity for autistics to engage in perspective taking as if they were pieces of empirical evidence that I had to deal with. Interestingly, of course, that is a bad fit with my general views. So I accept the call out. And as this quote brings out, it's in fact ironic that I should say such things because, as others know, I never really accepted that perspective taking is the primary mechanism for understanding others, as we just saw. So this is a sort of double irony in its own way. But I think that a form of that risk comes to us all because we might use theorizing, or what ToM, the last word I want to say on this is what ToM might have to do with it is that we have a tendency to bring theorizing into our interpersonal engagements through stereotyping and other means. And that's Sometimes a useful heuristic, if you're willing to adjust and understand and recognize it as such. If you're in individual engagements with others, that can be, as we probably all know, extremely dangerous. Sometimes it's an aid, but it has to be treated with a pinch of salt and be ready to be adjusted. So, last word, I would say, and this is from Milton's own piece, 10 years on, of the double empathy problem. The concept of double empathy has the potential to aid a reframing of autism itself. I think there's some truth in that. From a social communication disorder to a description of a broad range of developmental differences and embodied experiences, and how they play out in specific social and cultural contexts. If this were so, it would lead to a radical change to current diagnostic criteria. Well, I just to say, he had me at radical change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the amazing talk. I'll just move to the Q&A session. Are there any questions in the room first? So, one, and you have one, Rado? You have one as well? Okay, so they will come here and then we will move to the questions online.
No problem.
Hi, this is Pooja. I have a
Hello.
question for you. Hi. So, the approach that you propose and the predictive processing approach, are they close to the idea that we need to focus on the aspect of abstract thinking as opposed to theory of mind in autistic people?
Well, I mean, look, I think as you heard in the talk, I'm challenging. Look, there are different versions of the predictive processing account, as you probably know of. There always are, and some of them adjust, but all of them seem to some way committed. And I've asked this question of different thinkers, like Andy Clark, for example, about whether they're going to stick with the idea that they're really using that analogy very seriously about the idea that the brain is making inferential hypotheses. So let me just say that that's the problematic notion. So understanding, I think, and let me say where I'm sympathetic to predictive accounts. I think we have a whole bunch of anticipatory responding. I've written on this quite a bit in the 2017 book Evolving in Activism. So it's not that I think that we shouldn't think of our whole organisms as very much anticipatory, and also that when we perhaps master certain capacities to think contentfully, we can engage in logical, abstract thinking, and we might have certain tendencies in that direction. What I am challenging is, and it's about the origins of what would be required to make sense of a contentful prediction made by the brain. So that's where I'm usually backing away completely from that claim. So um, I'm often very much in tune with salvaging things, so I'm not suggesting that it's not an all or nothing thought for me. Like it's not like the whole of that field is bankrupt or useless or anything of that kind. It just that's the targeting that core claim that would need serious adjustment if the arguments that I was presenting had to go through. And so we'd need to accommodate what those tendencies or what that capacities for abstract thinking and why they're more dominant in certain individuals. That's a different explanation would have to come from that rather than if I'm right that the brain is forming hypotheses. Thank you.
And there will be another question from
That's
the
fine.
room.
That's fine.
I'm delighted by your presentation, um, Daniel, Daniel
It's
Hutto. Um, my question would be, I mean, I'm very curious since you mentioned at the end about the cultural extension of the double empathy problem, and this inspired my question, which would go further and ask how would you conceive through the inactivist lens of information as dynamic and
mhm.
as well, not a content, but as a dynamic. How do you conceive of the autistic life role in an inactivist fashion?
The autistic life world. Well, several things in that question. I don't want to convert. I'm really solid on not messing with what information is. I think I'll leave that to the scientists, and that's one of the arch pieces in my argumentation because it's a point of agreement with my classical cognitivist opponents, right? So you can't have a good argument unless you agree about something, and that's one of the things that we tend to agree about, actually, even today. There have been attempts, you're right, to convert the notion of information itself into something different, but I think we're talking about different notions of information, and there are many
Uh,
different notions in that.
I want to
Yeah,
interrupt you. Okay,
sure.
okay. Yes, I apologize. I'm actually on very much on the inactivist side.
Okay,
So I will
that's good.
cross back,
Okay, so,
cross out anything about information. So the question would be simply
hmm,
how be the inactivist model of the autistic lifehold? That is the
good.
question. So
It's a good question. So I think the where I've moved to on this is I don't want to create a model of an autistic life world. Rather studiously in my talk, you don't see me doing that. Not in the new work that I've been doing. I think when I started out, we were receiving a whole bunch of accounts of what it was like to be from the outside. I think that what an activist position entitles everyone to do is to say, look, there's a vast amount of cognitive diversity in all individuals, and they're going to be complex. So yes, there will be certain tendencies, traits, but they aren't going to be distributed evenly across individuals. So, and I don't think even I'll come back to a Wittgensteinian, more Wittgensteinian way of doing things, which is my favorite way, right? Wittgenstein's never going to give you a substantive account of a life world of anyone, right? That's a very open-ended claim about you're going to have to dig into the individual practices and look to see how people are actually using their terms and their ideas, using their language. That's going to be a very detailed and difficult case by case kind of investigation. So I would encourage the same kind of thought here for any, let's call it any cognitive life world, both of collective units, which may have some pattern practices in common, and then you're going to look down into individuals where you're going to find even more variations. So maybe some tendencies and traits, right? Of course, you can find commonalities across populations because they'll share some of the same patterns and practices. That's the answer that I would give. So it requires a lot of detailed and careful investigation, and that's why I'm attracted to the kind of double empathy idea that it requires that kind of adjudication, nuance, attention to detail that is often blurred when we're trying to generalize.
yes, yes, yes. Thank you very much. That just shows how much more research needs to be done.
It does actually. Yeah, we need more research, that's for sure. That's another big outcome from the paper.
And now, hmm? Right, and now I have a couple of questions online. Mauro Lenti and then Vladi.
Okay.
Oh,
I-
yes. Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was so interesting. I have another question, sorry, about the predictive processing and free energy
That's
principle. I
fine.
don't know if you agree with that. Yeah, because there is this, in my opinion, weird line of research which tries to, let's say, looking for the compatibility between an activist ecological framework and the free energy principle. And for me, it seems quite strange to claim for this particular idea, since the free energy principle is by itself, in a sense, unecological due to the inferential process. So basically,
Yeah.
for the Markov blanket story, we have to pose a sort of indirect attunement between the organism, the living system, and the environment. Also, there are some there is a particular autistic account, let's say autism explanation account, which tries to imply the skill intentionality framework. So basically,
Mm,
another version, let's say, of predictive
yeah.
processing and free energy principle, uh, in this, let's say, an activist source. So basically, I wanted to ask you for some thoughts about the relation between free energy principle and activists. I know this is
Yeah,
a huge question, but if you can just
it's fine. It is a big topic. I suppose my earlier answer repeats. So I usually work. I'm old school philosopher in this respect. So I work from my foundational argumentation, right? So I think, if when I can argue, for example, as I have, but with the hard problem of content that I mentioned really quickly and the information processing challenge. So it'd be something like this. You could almost logically infer what I'll have to say, insofar as those approaches are centrally wedded to those conceptions. Um, then they will raise problems. And insofar as they're not, then we have room to negotiate and adjust theorizing. So in these cases, I surely do know people who've advanced versions, non-representationalist version of the free energy principle. I even think there's some who do a bit of the predictive processing. I've gestured at how you might use some of the things, but of course it's not then it's not unadulterated. So I'm a pretty hardcore negotiator when it comes to theorizing. It's not a compatibilist position. Many people, I think, really quite frankly, and I can tell you this is my analysis from the theory of mind debate, think that hybrid positions are good, whether as good as hybrid cars and things like that. They often suck. They contain the problems of both, and you get some impaired, less theoretically elegant version of the thing that you wanted. So I'm not saying they're impossible to do those things, but you'd have to have a pretty good reason, right? And they'd have to be having really clear job functions that worked, and the totality would have to work better. Often you want a more clean sweep, and so you might need to acknowledge these in different ways. So, for example, there's a whole thriving business in treating the free energy principle a bit more abstract. It's a bit more like if it holds at all, and there's all sorts of questions there, it's a bit more like a physical set of laws rather than describing things that are actually going on in the brain by means of using inferences, etc. Right? So there's an awful lot of debate about its status, whether it's whether it's whether we would want to buy it without adjustment, right? Whether we need to change the scope about it. But even more, the thing that really is the trickier one is to the extent in which the things described by this are making inferences. Now, given that it's wide scoped, typically that doesn't look good because it's supposed to apply to things like pendulums and whatnot. And nobody, as far as I know, really wants to say that they're making inferences. So that can't be an absolute requirement of those approaches, and therefore that pushes us in the direction of handling this in a way that doesn't confront the issues that I just raised. So I think, but the broad answer is there's more work. The last questioner said there's more research to be done. There's always more research to be done, and you could my usual move is to tinker with things if they have value. And if they don't have a lot of value, then I drop them because they're not going to be very helpful for understanding the phenomenon in question. So one of our challenges as researchers is to figure out which one of these things is actually going to get us some headway on the questions that are interest, at least to us. And sometimes it turns out those things that are very popular don't. You might think that was true of the modular theory of mind. It's really popular for a little while now, not so much, and certainly not in the version that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. So, be careful where you hitch your wagon as well. That's another thing. So that's probably there's much more to be said on that, but it's of course some of the other activists, as you probably already know, are very down on it for other reasons, right? So there's a paper by Ezekiel and Evan Thompson, for example, where they almost start swearing about this forking path.
Yeah, I can remember. Also because I think in this particular, let's say, use of the free energy principle in the for explaining out spectrum, it's difficult to say because being autism a neurodevelopmental disorder, and also because Freestone in some papers said that free energy principle is not actually able to deal with the changing of a living system, of this set of probability.
Yep.
For me, this
He
is an
they
important point.
introduced in recent, and again, always innovations. I think they introduced something like an adaptive version of it in some recent papers too. So again, there's always possibilities, but yeah, one wants to see whether or not you're also putting epicycles onto your system as well at some point in order to meet the needs of explaining the phenomena, right? So that's another danger. But yes, thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for your time.
And Vladi?
Sorry, I have problems with the sound.
Hello. Hi.
Greetings, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Hutto. I wanted to comment that the biggest punch in the gut to the theory of mind was actually delivered by reality itself. As much um, as we can now see, lately diagnosed autistics and how the perception that they have problems with theory of mind start to crumble.
Yeah.
Including actually myself. I'm also discovered my autism only several years ago as an adult. So it gives so much more ground to the theories that include other methods of inference regarding social situations, including an activism. So that's very hopeful. And my question is, um, have you had already some research or insight regarding the inactivist and embodied cognition approach to how people on the autistic spectrum interact with each other? For instance,
Yeah. I was interested to see that. No, the fast answer I'll just say is no. I haven't been engaged much in it. As I said when I opened up, and I was very grateful for the invitation to give the keynote. These are topics close to my heart, but I haven't been working solely on them. I'm juggling on stuff, for example, on just general educational principles in the classroom at the moment, and another paper on uh, memory, which is another one I want to break. If I can take memory for an activism, that's going to be a big thing. And in terms of punches in the gut, maybe that's not the whole reality, but I think classical cognitives would be very sad to know they've lost memory as well. So that's been the focal point. But when I did read the material in preparation for this talk, I was very interested in that very question that you just raised, which is, what are the interacting profiles? Apparently, from what I can read, but I don't see the evidence around that yet, it's supposed to be easier. So the claim is between autistic individuals interacting with themselves as opposed to the pairing up of non-autistic individuals with autistic. Well, that sounds at least prima facie plausible, but I don't know. I haven't looked into it in any detail. Do you know of any literature that we should be looking at, or any research that's being done in this regard?
I have read something regarding autistic communication, which was written by other neurodivergent people, and I have first-hand experiences with this too. So what I found most interesting is that some parts of environmental cues are often ignored by the people on the spectrum, and the others are emphasized more. For
Yeah.
instance, you can look at the topic of how much less information people on the spectrum get from facial expressions or the body language, and how much more attentive they are to wording and
Right.
the specific patterns in speech.
Very, very nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. Someday I'll have to test whether I'm on the spectrum or not, because I think that's what I pay attention to an awful lot myself. As a philosopher, that's normal for my business. The other thing I guess I would say from my own firsthand experience, assuming that I am neurotypical, I don't know, but let's supposing so, I definitely think the idea that neurotypical people have smooth interactions is completely ridiculously
No, they
overrated.
don't.
So that's just absurd itself, right? So that's a starting point, right? Some individuals within those sets get on better than others and find it easier to interact, and vice versa. So I think that's another kind of, when we frame things like this is one of the things I would want to question, what are we really saying here? As if that could be a general truth, right? So as if these are all things I think we need to start to also challenge rather than necessarily shore up with research. So interesting, very, really interesting topic. Thank you.
Well, I would like to say that autistic people don't have problem with ToM. They have problem with other people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Sartre did too. And so it's yeah, they aren't, let me put it like that, they're not alone. Good.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks again for the amazing talk for the Q&A session. Here's another round of applause.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I don't want to block you. You're getting behind in your time. I can see that now. I would love to stay. I might stay for a bit and then eventually fade because it's getting late and I've been doing a 14-hour fast and I've also got to finish another paper tomorrow, which is insane, but it's like that. The conference, I just want to say, really looks first rate. I mean, the other talks really look very exciting, a really nice program. If I'm jumping out, genuinely, if I was at the event there at the right time frame and in a different setup, I would certainly attend everything. But it's a little tricky in Australia, and especially under these circumstances. We also have builders in the house. If I show, so it's rather I'm under fire from every possible direction. But I really wish you everyone the best, and we're looking forward to making touching base with people outside of this in some other contexts. Thank you so much, Sandra, for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here with us, despite all of the stuff that seems to be going on there. Thank you. We'll just have a short 1 minute break so that I can make sure everything went well with the recording, and then we will move on to our next speaker. Thank you once again.